Dreamers, and welcome to another episode of the Doomloop Dispatch, the show about the worst things in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm your host, Kevin L. Jones, and with me, whenever possible, is my buddy
D. Scott Miller in the building.
Woohoo! It's always a good time.
Always.
And today we have the most amazing person, the most amazing homeless activist coming out of San Francisco, somebody who really is making a difference. And she happens to have a super cute dog as well. But this is small business owner, Christin Evans. She owns one or two bookstores.
So in San Francisco, the
Yeah.
Booksmith and the Haight-Ashbury, and then my husband and I jointly work on Kepler's in Menlo Park.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. In Menlo Park. Okay, cool. And then you also own the Olympic, which as how you say Olympic? Yeah.
Alembic, yeah, with an A.
Okay.
Alembic bar restaurant. Actually is a bar restaurant that's been in the Haight-Ashbury since 2006, and I'm the third owner.
Oh.
But it's right next to the bookstore, and it allows us to do cocktails at our author events.
Oh, that's perfect. That's genius.
Yep.
All right. Well, you're also a homeless activist and down in the trenches with this rough issue in San Francisco that's been going on for a long time. And first, I wanted to get into how did you get into these issues and working to help the unhoused?
Yeah, so before I had the Booksmith, I was working in corporate America. I had big tech clients. I'm an MBA, and so I wasn't really involved and engaged in like local political issues at all. I became more interested as a small business owner, as a group of merchants. We met and advocated for conditions that would be good for business and for our neighborhood. And homelessness was a topic that was really on neighbors' minds. Whether it was people feeling safe to come to shop on Haight Street, or part of it was like, why has homelessness been such an intractable long-term issue? Haight-Ashbury in particular, known for having what's called transitional age youth, or young people, right? People that are maybe aged out of the foster care system, or they've left a difficult home situation. And so they're on the younger side, and they don't, so a lot of times the folks in the Haight-Ashbury are also not born, raised San Francisco. They're, folks that have come from particularly other parts of California. And so there was this kind of under resource that was being allocated to this population because they were younger and they were, not mostly not from here. So most of the resources the city at the time, this is like circa 2007 when I took over the Booksmith, um, were going towards veterans and what's called chronically homeless. So you had to be like homeless for over sometimes 20 years in San Francisco, homeless for over 20 years in San Francisco to qualify for housing assistance, for the supportive housing.
Wow.
Which was insane, right? And so you can imagine with that kind of wait list, the resources were not being allocated to young people. But at the same time, we knew from the research that the best way to prevent future homelessness is to actually get people that are, like really have short term people that are experiencing homelessness, have it be a very short period of time. And so I realized that there was like opportunity for really engaging with the public and a dialogue and discussion about how to address homelessness, not just in my neighborhood in Haight-Ashbury, but citywide in San Francisco, where the money that we were spending was going, why there was need for more resource. And when I started, it didn't happen overnight, right? Like this over many years, I got to know the advocates, and I was invited to be a proponent for Proposition C, which was our city, our home, a 2018 ballot measure that raises about $300 million annually. Some years it's been more, some years it's been less, but roughly averages out to about 300 million per year. And that money goes to four major areas. I really became an advocate for trying to get Prop C passed. because I could see it wasn't going to solve homelessness in San Francisco. I mean, this is a decades long thing that's been happening, right? Like I grew up in the Bay Area. There's always been a visible homelessness in our community from, the 80s onwards for sure. Um, we can talk a lot about that, but essentially it's gotten steadily worse in the sense of more people, more need. And so understanding why this was such a difficult and challenging issue to try to address, I became very interested in that and understood that Prop C was one step towards systemic change, basically a doubling of the resources the city had to address homelessness. And it allocates the money in four different areas. 50% or more goes to housing, 25% or up to 25% goes towards behavioral health. So this is money that's going to the Department of Public Health for like a 24-hour pharmacy or treatment beds, boarding care facilities. And then 15% spent on eviction prevention. So one of the best ways to reduce homelessness is to stop homelessness from happening in the first place. So these are folks that may be on a fixed income or a little behind on rent, but helping them out with some rental assistance, legal assistance to ensure that they can stay in their home. And then 10% on shelter. So almost all the shelter that has been created since 2018 has been funded by Prop C, with the exception of like the tiny homes and some of the stuff that's come from the state.
Wow. That's crazy. Especially too when the whole thing about shelters and like, how Mayor Breed and everyone else just wants to shove the unhoused into shelters, the
Yeah.
fact that if it wasn't for your prop, they wouldn't even have more shelters,
Yeah.
It's so great to think.
So
Yeah.
it's one of those things that the advocates get attacked for a lot, is that we're not in support of shelter, and that we're like, Breed even put it in an op-ed in the Standard this last week that said that advocates were saying that they were asking her to do nothing about tents on the street, and that's so not true, right? Like and the fact that that gets repeated again and again in political conversation is really problematic, because it's a disinformation campaign, right? Because it basically says these folks are irrational, they're unreasonable, they're, like it doesn't make sense that we would leave people in a tent on the street. The reality is that the advocates care very much about the people in the tents on the street, and they want to make sure that they're getting connected to the resources that are going to permanently end their homelessness.
Right.
And sometimes a congregate shelter bed is not appropriate for everyone.
Well, I mean, and then that's something that I've been noticing too, is the way that the city government has been defining shelter. And then, like, and these shelters themselves are often like dangerous places, and especially for women, and especially for young people. I mean, just the whole idea that you're just going to like have a dormitory bed in this really unsupervised space, and you're saying that a person is actually safer there than they are in their own like enclosed places. I mean, like that's not shelter. That's something closer to like a dangerous little prison.
Yeah.
It kind of looks like. But I also wanted to compliment you on your piece in the Standard as well. Look, it was short, powerful, to the point. And I want to suggest that everyone go and read your piece at SF Standard this week.
Yeah, we will definitely be linking it to this episode for sure.
Thank you. Yeah. What I tried to do with that piece was just talk about the brutality of the sweeps and also the futility of them, right? Because it's such an expensive endeavor that the city's engaged in, and it's what essentially resulting in people being moved to the next block for the most part, right? And that is not a solution to homelessness.
No. And even worse, what you're pointing out was that a lot of these people are trying to get off the streets, and the fact that the city workers are literally throwing away their paperwork and making it harder for them to get the resources they need. It just seems so futile and cruel.
Cruel. That is the absolute word. Yes.
So, I've been going to these encampment resolutions as an observer for many years now. Started in 2020 during the pandemic when people were sheltering in place, people on the street, the mayor's executive order that issued the shelter in place order exempted homeless people. And they said, well, unless you don't have shelter, don't shelter in place. So homeless people are exempted from this. And they did open up close to like a little over 2,000 hotel rooms, shelter in place hotel rooms, but we had close to 8,000 people that were unsheltered at that moment because they were emptying out the congregate shelters because people were sleeping like 3 feet apart, and that was just like a huge problem for the health department to manage viral spread in the congregate shelters. So they basically emptied out the congregate shelters. So all the folks that were sheltered were put to the street, and then we had just thousands of people that were not helped by the shelter in place hotels. So mostly they helped people over 60 and people with chronic health conditions that made them more susceptible to death from COVID. And then there was this weird thing that also happened around the UC Hastings law school, where UC Hastings threatened to sue the city, and they had a settlement agreement where they put more than 400 people in a geographic radius around the law school into the hotels, whether they were 60 or above. It was just anybody who was ever in that, by geography, you got in. And in basically 15 days, I think they put like 433 people in hotel rooms. So, and that's like, extremely high acceptance, right? Like
Yeah.
95% acceptance of people going into these hotel rooms. And so like it really, like, you ask yourself, well, if we could do that during the pandemic, if we could get 90 to 95% acceptance of people leaving the street to shelter, then why can't we do that now? And the answer is the investments have been made in congregate shelter for the most part. There are some smaller portion of the shelters that are non-congregate or semi-congregate. But for the most part, when you go to these HSOC resolutions, that's the Healthy Street Operations Center managed by the Department of Emergency Management, they're basically offering a congregate shelter bed. That means a bunk bed, typically a cot in a very crowded room with maybe 60 other people or more, and you're only allowed to bring in belongings to fit in a little drawer that is underneath your bed. And so you're basically being asked to go into this challenging setting, right? Where it's really hard for, I snore. That's just like the base level. But think about also being in there with people with high acuity, like mental health and substance use disorder, and, people that are, screaming and having a crisis, right? Like at any moment in time, it's really hard to get a good night's sleep in these congregate shelter spaces, and that really traumatizes and makes it really challenging for people to get like a lot of folks that are experiencing homelessness have to go to work, they have to go to a job, and so or they have to get themselves to their housing appointments or their, so it's for a lot of people that have experienced congregate shelter, it's really, they know it's not for them, right? And there's many other reasons why people don't accept congregate shelter, but they would accept non-congregate shelter. And so I think that's really, when you see the mayor post these stats about we've had, we helped 4 people in today, and there were, 60% of the people that we talked to refused an offer. Well, she's not saying, but we didn't ask them what they would accept, and we didn't ask if they would accept a non-congregate
Mhm.
shelter or tiny home because they
Exactly.
didn't ask.
Yeah. What
So
is the congregate shelters though? Are they the best bang for your buck if you're investing? Oh, really? Like, I mean,
well,
or
you
at least just
see,
like a funding wise, or what?
well, so it's true that non-congregate shelter costs more than congregate shelter, but what's even more cost effective is to house people.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
And this is like a total misnomer. Like that, I can actually show you data from slides. Maybe I'll give that to you so you can link to it. That the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing puts out, that it actually costs us $20,000 or more less to house people than to shelter them. And the reason for that is a couple things. People who go into housing, they are contributing a portion of their income towards the rent.
Right.
Right. So because they get tenants rights by becoming housed, right? And so they're giving about a third or 30% of their income towards housing in the case of permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing, transitional housing. Um, and the other reason is because these shelters tend to be like people are kind of NIMBY about having a shelter in their neighborhood, right? And so they've done these like tent shelters, the navigation centers, where there was no plumbing, there was no kitchen facilities, there was, no electricity, no Wi-Fi. And so they basically had to put all of that infrastructure in. And then these tight sites are actually temporary. And so the cost of that is you basically have to annualize that over the lifetime of the shelter. It's not a really good bang for the buck. And so and they're also staffed really like 24/7 by security and caseworkers and intensive services wrapped around it, and so it's actually a more expensive um, way to address homelessness. Emergency shelters are really good for short-term stays,
Right.
for having people spend like ideally 60 days, but definitely less than 6 months. But at this moment, we have so few people exiting our shelters for housing, and it takes so long that we have a lot of people that are in shelter that have been there for years.
Jesus. And what's
So,
saying is,
I'll go.
uh,
I was gonna say I'll just give you like one example of somebody who like a shelter bed was totally wasted on that we could have just put into housing right away. So, elderly woman in her 70s became homeless because she was a caregiver and her long time she was a live-in caregiver. Her long time person that she was caring for passed away. She lost her housing. She's on Social Security income, $1,600 a month, right? Cannot afford a market rate rent on her own. So she became homeless. She was living in her car. She was couch surfing, paying like someone $600 to sleep on their couch. Lost that placement because of the pandemic, and went into a congregate shelter. Over 60 years old, but they had shut down the SIP admissions at that point. So she went into a congregate shelter. She got COVID twice.
Oh,
She was in the shelter system for 3 years, at a cost of $65,000 a year. She's willing to work, has been working as a caregiver, and it took all of that time to get through the backlog of people that are on the wait list for housing, for assistance for housing, to get her finally placed. And she does not use substances, and she doesn't have extreme mental health issues, right? But a person like her is an example of one of the fastest growing type of people experiencing homelessness that we have in the city, which is people that are over 50 years old and are experiencing homelessness for the first time.
oh man. And I want to kind of go back to one of the points you just made about her, the fact that she's not a substance user. I think a big part of the kind of demonization of the homelessness and to try to kind of convince people that these cruel measures are okay is because they want to paint everybody as like a junkie. But I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, that's not true. You're not seeing that, right? It sounds like everyone you're talking to and watching them being swept away has a job, even.
yeah.
So I'm not gonna downplay it. We know that between 20 and 40% of the homeless population do have some combination of substance use disorder and mental health disorder, and like high acuity kind of mental health uh, issues and challenges. And that is because we have a really bad, healthcare system,
Yeah.
right? We do not have treatment on demand. We don't have mental health care on demand like that. It gets to the point where the system is only responsive when you get to the point where the person has been violent or deteriorated, decompensated so much that they are basically a burden to the system. They're hitting the ER too much, so they get more intensive case management services. So we have people with traumatic head injury. We have people that are schizophrenic. These are health conditions, right? These are health conditions, and they are on the street. They are living on our streets.
Right. Also, I mean,
And it,
self-medication is also a thing too. I think that like that's the other thing that's overlooked. Like the causation between when did you
yes,
start using? When did you start using? Was it when the system abandoned you?
Yeah.
Like
yes,
did you abandon the system, or is your use actually the cause, a result of you being abandoned by the system?
Mhm.
I know a lot of people that actually cannot get a hold of their meds, who end up finding themselves trying to self-medicate through ways that are not
yes.
healthy, right?
Yeah.
So I found the argument specious and also very cruel. So I mean, like it's just
Absolutely. I'm glad that you brought that up because there's a lot of folks that, like I mentioned in the Haight-Ashbury, I've been a small business owner there, and I meet a lot of folks that come to the neighborhood, that are seeking, some tribe of people that they can relate to, that they're gonna fit in. And I've met young women who were like, I wish I didn't have to drink at night to sleep. Like, there's like this, like we don't talk about alcohol, but alcohol is actually a bigger contributor to death on some level than fentanyl. I mean, it's both, but they're both bad, right? Like, and chronic alcoholism and long-term impacts of chronic, habitual abuse of alcohol is also really bad for your physical, outcome. And you actually, historically, we saw when homelessness became a modern construction, it was Vietnam vets, right? People coming from war that were traumatized by their war experience, and they were self-medicating. And that's who was like the most prototypical, like, homeless person that you would see living visibly on the street. But there were always these folks that had experienced not necessarily wartime trauma, but other forms of trauma,
yeah,
sexual abuse, violent home abuse. They witnessed, a murder, or they witnessed abuse of family members. Just some horrific things. I've met, people that became pregnant by their parent twice. Like, things like that. Like some, and like the trauma, the childhood trauma is really hard to recover from if you don't have the appropriate systems in place to address that trauma. And so young people who have had trauma then start drinking very early, or they start using substance use very early. This, like, really cascades into their longer term lifetime, where they become like homeless through their 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond, right? And
right.
so we really want to actually address that situation as soon as we can, right? Like, as soon as people are touching the system. And so, like, there's been a big effort to try to educate healthcare providers and other services like schools that are coming in contact with folks, to really try to connect people to those services that will reduce the likelihood of substance use disorder and alcoholism, because they do lead to, like, more long term, like, really challenging to the chronic homeless folks that we're seeing out on the street.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah. And that brings me to my next question of kind of the cruelty and kind of just ignorance about solutions that actually work, and not just shove people away. Because it seems like you were talking about Prop C passed in the aughts. And then it seems like the kind of cruel solutions. I mean, Mayor Breed supported the Grants Pass case on the Grant Pass side, which is horrible. But it seems like it's been wrapping up since around the Twitter break, because I remember what the same year as the Twitter tax break, they passed a sit lie ordinance.
Yeah.
Do you think there's something related there, that now we have this kind of especially like property value investment, we getting these harsher techniques to dealing with the unhoused?
So, for Prop C, which we ran the campaign in 2018, I had
Mm,
written a
sorry.
Medium piece, that talked about the history of homelessness in San Francisco politics. And I went back to Feinstein and Reagan in the early 80s, right? Because we had like a situation where there was this defunding of the public housing. There was also emptying of the mental health facilities.
Yep.
And that was the first time we had a sit-lie law. Feinstein actually
Oh.
advocated for a sit-lie law back in the early 80s, right?
Wow.
And the idea that homelessness is an unsolvable problem and it was not created by local politicians is, like totally false. It is not only solvable, it's also, been a useful political tool for divisiveness in our politics, right? Just the way that Trump will come down his elevator and talk about the people coming from Mexico. It's a creating of a threat, a fear, an other.
Mm-hmm.
We see throughout this history of San Francisco politics, homeless people being that other, right? That homelessness has been a top San Francisco voter concern for decades, right?
Yeah.
Like you can actually go back to the Chronicle stories and see like how this played out in the late 80s, early 90s and onwards. But each mayor, campaigned on addressing homelessness in some way, shape, or form.
Wow. Man,
And
I'm glad you brought that thing up about Reagan because my mother's a social worker who used to actually work in a facility that they used to call it was called the rehabilitation center, where if you were a person who were actually in a crisis, you could come there. They would give you all the services that you need, free of cost, and then like patch you up, find a place for you to live, get you some training. And Reagan dismantled all of that.
Yeah.
Like
yeah,
the issue that we're really dealing with today is like he dismantled something that was so essential, and he took the parts and he took them so far apart from each other that we can't put them back together again. So I mean, I don't think a lot of people actually they make the observation that this is not like anything new. This is just a snowball that's rolling down this really shitty hill. Yeah.
that's right. And at the federal level, we've seen a disinvestment in public housing, right, and subsidized housing, and we at the same time we've seen corporate tax rates go down,
Mm-hmm.
and these are related things, right?
Yeah.
The shifting of the burden of addressing homelessness to the local, state, and city level, the
Mm-hmm.
county level, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when HUD distributes funds annually, we get about, as a city, $63 million for shelter and housing. When we passed, before Prop C was passed, we had in total about 300 million. So a lot of the burden had already been shifted to the local general fund.
Right.
With Prop C, we actually doubled the resource, right? We increased the amount of money that we were spending on homelessness to about almost 700 million. And right now it kind of fluctuates between 650 and 800 depending on what year. It's up, it's down. but let's just say it's roughly 700 million, right? Um the majority of that, about 500 to 600 million of it is from Prop C and the general fund, from local taxes.
Mm.
And so when you see a big pushback from, conservatives like Elon Musk or Gary Tan,
Yeah.
or, I put Mark Farrell and, London Breed in that category. To
Yep.
some extent, Daniel Lurie's in that category too, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about people that are they spent a lot of time talking about how San Francisco is inhospitable to business.
Yeah.
And what they're saying is like we actually need to clear these folks out of the way because we want our city to be growing and thriving and economically like flourishing, right? And what they're saying is that we can't tax these companies that are bringing in like lots of employees from not from here
Yeah.
because that would, impact our growth, our economic vitality, right?
Mhm.
And that's the balance, right? We're talking about who pays for these solutions. Homeless people certainly did not create the affordable housing crisis, right? They did not, right? And as I mentioned, the homeless system is not just addressing people that are homeless because of substance use and mental health. We are also addressing just economic conditions for people who, again, fastest growing category, people over 50 uh, on fixed income because they're senior or disabled,
Mm.
and they literally cannot pay their rent. Like they cannot keep up with the rent.
Yeah.
Right. So
Unbelievable.
for every one person that we're housing, we have 3 more people coming into the system. So the inflow is impossible, right? Like it's like we basically continue to have a crisis of affordability. People like the woman that I mentioned that was 3 years in the shelter should never have we should never have sent the money housing her in an expensive emergency shelter.
Right.
We just needed to get her to an affordable unit of housing that she could afford.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I
And
was
that
thinking about SROs. Are they
we need to
still
get
are SROs still in the conversation? Single residence occupancies, like say in hotel rooms. I mean, I remember back in the early '90s that was actually an option for a lot of people who were being unhoused. Are people even having those discussions anymore about SROs and things like that?
so interesting thing that happened with the dot-com boom in the early 2000s, and then it got, all through the mortgage-backed security crisis, and then it continued into like the tech boom that we had that went up until the pandemic. And then, honestly, the tech companies did very well during the pandemic. So,
Mhm.
the tech fueled boom to some extent continued. we what we have seen is that the precious land and buildings are being turned into market rate housing.
Mm.
We've had a loss of rent controlled units. We've had a loss of affordable housing, right? Like we've had people that were in a rent controlled unit that were owner move in evicted or Ellis Act evicted, right?
Mhm.
So they're basically we are losing housing that everyday people can afford. Like these are the folks that are working in my bookstore and bar and restaurant. These are the folks that are working city jobs. These are
Yes.
folks that are, like
Teachers.
these exactly, right? And
Yeah.
so we're forcing those folks into the homeless system, or we're basically pushing them out of town,
Yep.
right? And so that displacement that's been happening has been happening for decades. And who's getting rich? Who's benefiting from that system?
Exactly.
Real estate interest, right? So that's why you have Mary Jung and the San Francisco Realtors Association are super fans of Mark Farrell and London Breed, right? Like these are the
Mhm.
folks who fund their campaigns, that staff their campaigns. Like they actually, like the campaign manager for Mark Farrell worked for Mary Jung. You can't make this up, right? You can follow the money, you can follow the people, and you can see that the people that benefit from pushing working class people out of the city, because these are realtors, they get the way they make money is they get a percent of the sale price, right? So they
Mhm.
have a strong financial motivation for the price to go up,
Yep.
only up, right?
Yes. And having to look at the pores hurts your curb appeal, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, God, it's such cruel, selfish views of
Greedy
this
bastard.
situation. It's terrible. And I have to wonder too, because what was pointed out, there was a video recently showing a DPW worker, right, who was clearing a homeless person's belongings and really like throwing their stuff away. I'm trying to remember the video, but like it was stuff they needed, and they're just chucking it all away, and it's just so cruel. Do you think they're getting directions to be this cruel? I mean, do you think that is a
Yeah.
directive?
Well, I mean, like, because Brooke Jenkins actually said that homeless people should be made uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, so,
Both Jenkins and Breed said that. Yeah.
Mm.
yeah,
Like so the answer is yes. The written policies versus what politicians say, is a little bit different. Like the written policies say things like they will bag and tag people's property.
Mm-hmm.
In practice, we know that that's not happening as much as it needs to be happening. It's like the initial Coalition on Homelessness lawsuit was centered around the fact that they had data from the city that showed at these encampment resolutions there were no bag and tags. Like they were hundreds of these sweeps, and there were no like zero bag and tags. So like there was this like evidence that the city had in its own data collection that showed that the city was violating its own policies. And why is that? Because the different departments have different responsibilities, right? DPW's responsibility is to keep the streets clean.
Mm.
It's not their responsibility to find shelter for people. It's their responsibility to keep the street clean. So DPW staff that have been there for many years and have been, come up in the system. This is under Nuru, right? Like Nuru was the head of DPW for a long
Famously
time.
corrupt Nuru, like literally heart of a corruption scandal Nuru. Anyways.
But like he was very much the tone for the top, right, of the department for a long time, and a lot of the people that still are the supervisors, the middle management, the even the frontline staff, they've been part of this culture of we need to clear out and have a clean they actually take a pre-picture and a post-picture, right, to show that they did their job.
Yeah.
But they're not mandated with preserving people's rights and helping them get housing. So what's happened is
They're
that
a cleanup crew.
the
They're not supposed
signal has been made very clear to DPW what their job is. And SFPD, same, right? Like SFPD, they basically are to clear calls. They get calls, they have to respond to the calls, the complaints, and they just they deal with it. And mostly they don't have tools, like they don't have the non-congregate offers to give.
Right.
So what they're doing is they're issuing a move along order, right? They're saying, pack this up or I'm going to write you a ticket. And we've actually seen people getting tickets, right? Again, like this is the first time since before the pandemic that we've really seen this extremely robust effort to criminalize homelessness again, to actually literally give somebody a piece of paper that says you have been cited and you have been arrested and cited for illegal lodging, for sleeping outdoors. That is your crime. And your crime now comes with a punishment of up to $1,000 fine and or 1 year in jail.
Yeah, that's and bringing it back to the Grants Pass versus Johnson. Johnson was a homeless woman, like a senior homeless woman that basically had been cited so much she was thousands of dollars in debt. Like she owed thousands, and basically was told, get the hell out of our city.
Well, I mean, also, I've heard of stories where a person gets that fine, and because they have that citation, if you have your ID, and that's if they haven't taken it from you, like they can actually take you and put you overnight in jail. And if you get enough overnights in jail, you end up going to county. And if you do county, you do 30, you do 60, you do 90. Like, but it all begins with these citations. It all begins with like you get caught sleeping outside. It's been like that for a while now. It's been like that for a while.
And a criminal record in a housing market that's primarily reliant on market rate housing and for-profit housing.
Yeah.
Basically, that also eliminates most of your housing options, right? And so you get put on these really extreme, long, extended wait lists. So waiting for a Section 8 voucher, waiting for an opportunity to go into a permanent supportive housing unit or get a local voucher that we've created with Prop C, more vouchers, right? But you're basically being, like warehoused on the street, warehoused in these emergency shelters for years, waiting for your turn to get to that housing.
Terrible. Oh man. Well, okay. So now one thing that the kind of city government is touting, and you can see it because what the the Standard just published a piece about what happened with the RV residents now. So they've been clearing out these kind of RV encampments, which have had a lot of asylum seekers from Venezuela, but we're talking like full families living in these RVs. And I just saw a Standard piece, I think, that ran today about how one of these families got an apartment subsidy. So their family four kind of forced to live in a 1-bedroom, which would drive my kids nuts. But at that same time, they're getting some help. It sounds like they still have to. It's a subsidy, so it's not covering the whole thing. It sounds like. What are your opinions about the subsidy solution?
So the RV thing is a whole other issue because what we saw in the last point in time count is we saw a surge in family homelessness and we saw a surge in vehicularly homeless, right? And so these aren't these aren't folks that are necessarily substance use and mental health disorder. These are folks that are the working poor, right? Like
Yes.
they actually just don't qualify for housing, right? Market rate housing. And so they need assistance with their housing. So what the city has been doing with the RVs is a unforced error. It's actually creating more headaches for everybody.
Oh.
What they've done is they've responded to pressure from neighbors who didn't like seeing these vehicles, and they started doing enforcement. They actually started putting up tow signs, right, and 4-hour parking signs, and so people get cited enough that their vehicle gets taken from them, and so it's creating homelessness. It's actually a problem. Like an RV could technically be considered a form of housing. It's or a form of shelter anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so while it's not ideal, it's better than having folks on the street.
Yeah.
And so what we've actually done by trying to enforce these towing laws, right, is we're not giving people adequate alternatives. Like we are not standing up enough places for people to put their vehicles, right? So people are essentially being asked to go into housing, but they can't afford the housing, and they also aren't high acuity. Like the algorithm hasn't scored them high enough because they haven't been homeless for long enough. They don't, they actually make enough money, like that disqualifies them for subsidized housing. They there's so many things I can tell you about. I mean, it's there also, as you said, a lot of folks that are. We know that actually, like 40% or so of the families are people that are basically newly homeless from job loss. And
Oh.
so they're and then there's another group that you're talking about, the migrant folks that are coming, and they're maybe undocumented. So
Mhm.
there are like different components of this, but in either case, what the city's solution for this is people are having maybe a short-term crisis. We're going to give them a temporary 2-year subsidy to
Mhm.
help them get into apartment, and then the fingers crossed moment is that they'll be able to stabilize and improve their income enough to no longer need the subsidy. So
Super easy to do. Yeah.
Especially when there are no jobs for these people.
Yeah, exactly.
Great.
And
so,
bosses
so
love giving raises.
so it is all connected to people's ability to earn enough, right? So, we've increased the minimum wage in San Francisco, but the minimum wage is still not a living wage.
Mm.
Even though it's gone up, it's still not enough to afford housing and cover your other costs.
And the utter refusal to tax the rich. But that's ultimately where we're looking at. We're looking at the utter refusal of San Francisco to tax the rich. It's tragic.
Yeah. Well, remember, we don't want to come off as hostile to business.
Oh, yeah.
Using these things that the government, from the beginning of the American government, we've been able to tax people. But no.
So, I mean, with all this information, I mean, what do you think would be a solution? Like, and I'm talking about let's talk about this like it's a crisis, because it actually is. What do you think would be like the thing that would solve the crisis, right?
So yeah, in my piece that you guys are going to link to in the Standard, I kind of broke it down to like short-term things we need to do and long-term things we need to do, right?
Right.
In the short term, we actually do have something close to 800 permanent supportive housing units that are just sitting there vacant. And that actually has been bureaucratic problem. Like we actually have paid money, budgeted money for these units of housing that are but chronically empty.
Wow.
Like since the city's been tracking this for years, at one point we had more than 1,100 of these vacancies. Now it's more than 700. It's close to 800, but it's been about 800 for a year, like the last year. They've not made a lot of progress in the last year. So we really need to address the housing vacancy. So we didn't mention it, but I'm on the Homeless Oversight Commission, and I've actually called that on our monthly meetings from now on that we have a agendized item to talk about the vacancies, because that is just a clear area of bottleneck that has been intractable to solve, and we need to fix that.
Yeah.
The second thing we really do need to do, because we have increased a lot of the resources for housing and shelter with Prop C, but we have failed to do is provide more treatment on demand.
Mm.
So we do have a lot of folks that are willing to go into treatment facilities. 90-day programs are what we're offering now. If you read the expertise from like people that run Health Right 360 and those folks, they'll say like ideally people need to go into like 2-year transitional housing programs, right? Like they need to be able to kind of overcome the substance health, mental health, challenges and stabilize, get connected to schooling or job opportunities, create new habits. 90 days, you're not going to accomplish that. That's
Right.
just too little time. And so we really need to actually fund more beds for people that are struggling, that need to get to that level of stability.
Right.
And those folks may need to also be placed into permanent supportive housing at a later date. Like not all of them are going to graduate out, you know, with no future help. Like remember I was talking about those young people, childhood trauma, like lots of things going on, like the 90-day treatment program stabilizes folks for like a short term, but then there's no direct connection to housing, and people most often end right back out on the street.
Mm.
Right.
So we've made this huge investment of like money to get people through a program, but then we've not made the investment to keep them stable and put all those other things that need to be in place for them to maintain their sobriety, to maintain their stability, to address their housing instability. We need to focus on that. So those are the two things that I think we really need to address the visible homelessness. Longer term, we also obviously need to deal with affordable housing, like as a as a real crisis, right? Like the affordable housing crisis, has been decades in the making.
Yeah.
And so, there's politicians like Dean Preston and just, Aaron Peskin and some other folks that have visions for large scale social housing, housing that is taken off of the for profit market,
Right.
that is basically there for people that are teachers, janitors, all like, because we have to acknowledge that we're a society, we can't all be tech CEOs, right? Like we
Mhm.
can't all be, you know, uh, six-figure salaries, right? And so we have to have folks, we have to have housing for people that are making less than $80,000 or less than $100,000 a year.
Yeah.
And so and that's a lot of people, right? And so we need to make sure that there's housing for people that make $30,000 a year or $40,000 a year, as well as people making $50,000 and $60,000 a year. And so you think about all of those, Hate Street employees that are in those 150 storefronts that are retail workers and restaurant workers. All of those folks need housing too, right? And so we need to make sure that we're ensuring that we have housing at all levels, and that is like that's a whole other Doomloop podcast.
Yeah.
Like how we
Totally.
address that, but that also is part of the reason why we can't solve homelessness overnight, is because the inflow to the homeless system is being created by our lack of affordability.
And right now, developers only want to build luxury, housing. That's it. There's not.
Empty. Building
Yeah.
them empty.
I
That's
mean, so
Yeah.
here are specific things that are like a policy ideas, right? So public bank, like the idea of having a San Francisco public bank that basically takes money that is already sitting in bank accounts earning interest and lend it to, instead of an oil pipeline, we lend it to affordable housing developer
Love it.
because there is a predictable return on that income. What a great investment it would be to have just large scale investments in affordable housing. Both Preston and Peskin have been big advocates of those of doing a public bank, of doing that type of lending, right? Another really good policy idea is vacancy control, right? So like we actually have passed uh, residential and commercial vacancy laws, right? That increases the fines and tracks the vacancies. So we have to make sure that we're really making sure that is working well, that units are getting reported, that the fines are escalating, creating those incentives for
yep.
the landlords to lower the rents, right? Because we want to make it costly for them to hold a vacant unit
Yep.
Yes.
off the market, right? And then another, really good idea is to focus on things like uh, taxation, right? Whether it be Prop C or Prop I or other taxes, to ensure that the people that are benefiting in these real estate economic situations, whether it's through transfer tax, so reducing speculative behavior,
Yep.
ensuring that the buildings that are over 10 million and above are taxed at a fair rate, at a progressive rate,
Mhm.
to ensure that we have pools of money to spend on subsidized housing. So that like these are things that we can do. We can also pass the state measure, the Justice for Renters Act. Forgetting what ballot number that is. It's on the state ballot, but it is going to actually help us do rent control on a different scale than we have now. Right now, you have to be in a building that's like from the 70s in order to built in the 70s to be able to be under a rent control, right?
Right.
If we that's it, the Costa-Hawkins law went into place so long ago that we now have buildings that were built in the 80s and 90s that are like essentially paid for, right? And that those buildings would be appropriate for rent control
Right.
Hmm.
now, right?
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
we want to make sure that people can't jack the rent up double digits, right? Like, I mean, it's like you get you in with a teaser rate.
Hmm.
They maybe even offer you like a free DVD player was the old thing. What's the new thing? Like the new TV set or
A printer.
electric bike or razor or
I mean,
whatever
that would actually make way more
yeah,
sense.
like whatever it is, it's like the teaser thing to get you into this unit. And then like a year later, they're jacking the rent up like, 20%, 30%, that kind of stuff. That we have some of those controls now in place. Like the state said that you can't go, I think it's above 10% now, but we need to have to really think about the rent controls that basically, ensure that the people aren't being squeezed out of their housing and paying more than basically a third of their income. Like we can't have rent burdened households because that creates other problems, right? When
Mhm.
people start cutting back in other areas like their healthcare or their ability to eat healthy and exercise and have a work life balance, like that, that compromises people's quality of life. So we want to make sure that our policy choices are leading to sustainable healthy communities,
Yeah.
and a big part of that is getting the housing in available and online
Yeah.
so that people aren't suffering negative health outcomes from not having stable housing.
Yes. And it's Prop 33 is the one that removes
Thank you.
Costa Hawkins. And I also want to point out too, do you know when Jello Biafra, singer of the Dead Kennedys, ran for San Francisco mayor in 78, even he was pushing a vacancy tax.
Right.
So even it's been an issue since all the way back then
Way to
to
go,
deal with.
Jello.
Yeah, it's crazy. This has been really great, Kristen. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I guess I have kind of one last question. If say Breed wins re-election, I mean, because we're all in agreement, probably Peskin is probably the best candidate running for San Francisco mayor this year. But if Breed or Farrell or Lurie wins, do you have any concerns that the homeless issues and at least the cruelty could get worse?
Well, I think honestly, the cruelty is the point right now, and it's being done for the politics. So I think there'll actually be some relief for people on the street after November, because the current level of spending on these sweeps is not sustainable, right? Like, it's costing the city a ton of money in DPW, SFPD. They've got fire out there. They've got sheriffs are going around in vans picking people up. We're actually putting people in jail, right? And so jails are full and at capacity. It's not sustainable. The sheriff's union's pushing back on that. If the jails continued at the levels they are now beyond November, I think you would have a sheriff union strike.
Oh,
like
wow.
like it is really bad right now, and they are just kind of like holding their tongue for this period of time until this election is done. But let me just say, like the current level, the current policies, the war on drugs mentality, the sweep homeless people into jails if they're not going into shelter, that kind of stuff is just not sustainable. Like, it's not actually able to continue at the way it is. I do think that Farrell has been the worst on the rhetoric, worse than Breed, which is saying
Kind of
something, because
lot.
she's been in office 6 years, and she opposed Prop C. She hasn't done meaningful things to change and improve the system to efficiency, like addressing these issues of the vacancies and addressing the issues of getting people into housing quickly from shelter. Like those are things that are completely in her power. She is the mayor in a very strong mayor city. She could have done that, and she
Mhm.
just didn't, right? And a lot of it is because I think her backers probably thought that they could at some point get political will to overturn Prop C. And so they
Wow.
did not want to make those investments, right? And so, yeah, I mean, they're always going to try to undermine progressive strides and progress, right? What we're making in terms of policy changes. I mean, Prop I, Prop C, some of these measures have really made some significant improvements for people in San Francisco, but the mayor's trying to redirect the Prop I money every budget cycle away from buying small sites to keep people housed. So like she literally is the problem.
Yeah. Great. Well, fingers crossed she's not reelected, and hopefully Peskin. I mean, seriously, that's all we can hope for. Well, again, Kristen, this was great. Thank
Yeah,
you so much for taking time to,
yeah,
and thank you for like fighting the good fight. I mean,
right,
honestly,
yeah,
taking the time to be on the streets,
yeah.
everything else. I mean, you're a small business owner. You don't really have to spend your time doing this. You could just be a citizen, but your activism is really appreciated.
Much
I
so.
mean, I learned so much from this, and I even read the piece, you know?
Yeah, me too. Right, right.
Thank you. No, I mean, I honestly think that it's a good thing for small businesses and for business people to like support real solutions, because it actually will lead to better outcomes for our employees, for our customers, and for our communities. So, I don't see them as disconnected things. I think it's actually the same thing.
All right,
Wonderful.
cool, cool.
Wonderful. All right. Well, that's it for this episode of the Doomloop Dispatch. Doomloopers, you can follow us on all the socials, Twitter, Facebook. Actually, no, I don't have a Facebook. What am I talking about? But we do have an Instagram and we do have a TikTok, but
And
also
of course, YouTube.
yes, and please subscribe on YouTube and please support us on Patreon.
Yes.
We don't know what we're doing next week, but we'll be doing something great, so make sure to tune in.
All right.
And until then,
Much.
keep
Thank you.
fighting the good fight. And thanks,
Good
Kristen.
fight. Thank you.
Thank you.